July, 1944. Saipan. The air is a thick, suffocating curtain of salt spray and the copper tang of cooling volcanic rock. Beneath a sky bleached white by a merciless Pacific sun, the world is reduced to the sound of rhythmic crunching, the heavy tread of leather boots on coral dust. In a makeshift stockade ringed by fresh coils of concertina wire, the first group of Imperial Japanese soldiers sits in the dirt. They are ghosts draped in tattered olive drab, their skin stretched tight over prominent ribs, eyes sunken into dark hollows of exhaustion. For these men, the war has reached a terrifying, silent crescendo. They have spent weeks in the limestone caves of the interior, surviving on little more than chewed sugarcane and the iron discipline of the Bushido Code. Now, as they sit in the shadow of American watchtowers, the silence is broken only by the low hum of distant generatoras and the occasional flap of a canvas tent in the humid breeze. This is the moment of the great shame, the threshold of a survival they were taught was impossible. The capture of these men represented more than just a tactical loss for the Japanese Empire. It was a fundamental rupture in their spiritual reality. To the soldiers of the 43rd Division, the very act of sitting in this enclosure was a violation of the Field Service Code, which dictated that death was the only honorable alternative to the ignominy of being taken alive. They had been told by their officers that the Americans were Kichiku-bei, monstrous devils who would torture, mutilate, and eventually devour their captives. As they watched the young tan GIs patrolling the perimeter with a casual, almost bored indifference, the prisoners remained tensed for the strike that they were certain was coming. Every movement of a guard's hand toward a holster or a canteen was interpreted as a prelude to execution. They expected the bayonet. They expected the lash. Instead, they were met with a logistical spectacle that was perhaps more terrifying than any weapon, the sight of a nation that could move mountains of material across an ocean as if it were a routine afternoon chore. In the center of the stockade, the primary source of their confusion began to manifest. A group of American cooks, their undersleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos of anchors and pin-up girls, began hauling large, galvanized metal vats toward a row of folding tables. The clatter of the heavy lids hitting the ground echoed through the camp like a series of small explosions. The prisoners watched with a mixture of suspicion and deep-seated hunger. To the Japanese soldier, food had become a sacred, disappearing commodity, measured in grams of maggot-infested rice and the occasional piece of dried fish. Here, before their eyes, was a display of casual abundance that defied their understanding of a world at war. They watched as the Americans began to stir a thick, viscous substance in the vats, the steam rising in the midday heat, carrying a scent that was entirely alien to the sulfur and rot of the Saipan caves. It was a smell of sugar, of milk, and of a civilization that still had the luxury of sweetness while the rest of the world burned. The prisoners exchanged glances of silent derision, certain that this was some final, bizarre humiliation before the end. The transition from the field to the stockade was not merely a change of location, but a violent collision of two irreconcilable worldviews. To understand why these men sat in the dust of Saipan with such rigid, fearful spines, one must understand the shadow cast by the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. For decades, the Japanese military machine had meticulously cultivated the concept of gyokusai, the shattered jewel. It was a philosophy that dictated that an entire unit should perish in a glorious suicide charge rather than endure the stain of surrender. In the minds of the men captured on Saipan, they were already dead to their families, their emperor, and their nation. To be a prisoner was to be a ghost, a man stripped of his humanity and his right to exist in the sun. This cultural conditioning created a psychological wall that the Americans, with their pragmatic approach to warfare, initially struggled to scale. The prisoners expected a hell that mirrored their own propaganda. They had been told that American soldiers were uncivilized barbarians who had no concept of honor. Many of the men in the stockade carried small, concealed blades or grenades, hoping for one last chance to take a devil with them before their inevitable execution. They looked at the Americans and saw giants, men fed on meat and dairy, standing tall and moving with a terrifying, relaxed confidence. The contrast was agonizing. While the Japanese soldier was taught that spiritual purity and self-denial were the keys to victory, the American seemed to draw his power from a bottomless well of material wealth. This was the logistics of democracy in its rawest form. The belief that a soldier should not only be armed with the best rifle, but should also be supported by a supply chain that reached all the way back to the dairy farms of the Midwest. As the sun reached its zenith, the reality of this industrial disparity began to sink in. The prisoners watched the horizon, where a line of Liberty ships sat anchored, their derricks swinging endlessly as they unloaded the machinery of war. But it wasn't the tanks or the artillery that haunted the Japanese survivors, it was the crates. Thousands of wooden crates marked with stencils that indicated contents far beyond the necessities of combat. There were crates of chocolate, crates of cigarettes, and, most bafflingly, crates of powdered milk and sugar. The historical weight of this moment cannot be overstated. For a Japanese soldier, whose supply lines had been severed by the relentless American submarine campaign, the sight of such surplus was a psychological blow as devastating as any naval bombardment. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of a nation that did not have to choose between guns and butter. It possessed the terrifying capacity to provide both in staggering, overwhelming quantities. The stockade was no longer just a prison. It was a classroom where the first lesson was the sheer, inescapable weight of American industry. The roar of the American logistical engine was not a single sound, but a symphony of industry that reverberated across the coral flats of Saipan. To the bedraggled prisoners, the sheer velocity of the American arrival was a phenomenon that defied their understanding of time and space. While the Japanese military had struggled for years to reinforce these distant outposts, the United States Navy and its construction battalions, the Seabees, seemed to conjure entire cities out of the jungle in a matter of days. The prisoners watched from behind the wire as bulldozers, massive and yellow, leveled the earth with a terrifying indifference to the terrain. These machines did not stop for the heat, nor did they falter under the weight of the task. They were the steel heralds of a nation that viewed war not just as a struggle of spirit, but as an engineering problem to be solved with overwhelming force and infinite supply. The arrival of a supply train near the stockade became a daily ritual of psychological warfare. Heavy trucks, their engines growling with a mechanical confidence, rolled past the enclosure in a seemingly endless line. Each vehicle was laden with the spoils of a distant, untouched mainland. Rolls of copper wire, stacks of plywood, and the ubiquitous, silver-glinting C-ration cans. For the Japanese soldiers, whose own supply lines had been reduced to living off the land, a euphemism for slow starvation, the sight was hypnotic. They observed the American GIs who jumped from the tailgates. These men did not look like the exhausted, desperate soldiers of the Emperor. They were well fed, their uniforms were often clean, and they handled their equipment with a casualness that suggested there was always more where that came from. A dropped tool was quickly replaced, a torn tarp was discarded for a new one. In the Japanese army, such waste would have been a court-martial offense. Here, it was merely the friction of progress. This logistics of democracy extended deep into the mundane details of camp life. The prisoners noticed that even the trash pits of the Americans contained more calories than their own best rations. Discarded tins of meat, half-eaten bars of tropical chocolate, and empty cigarette packs painted a picture of a society that possessed a surplus beyond imagining. The factual reality of the situation was stark. For every ton of supplies the Japanese managed to land on a Pacific island, the Americans were landing hundreds. This was the crushing weight of the assembly line brought to the front lines. As the Seabees erected prefabricated warehouses and humming refrigeration units, the prisoners began to realize that they weren't just fighting a military. They were fighting a factory that never slept. The supply train was the umbilical cord of a giant, and as it pulsed with the rhythm of crates and fuel drums, the Japanese captives felt the first true tremors of doubt. The war they had been told was a battle of superior will was, in reality, being decided by the sheer, unyielding volume of American steel and sugar. The initial interaction between the captors and the captives was a study in profound psychological friction. As the prisoners were led in small groups toward the processing stations, they moved with a braced posture of men walking toward a firing squad. They had been steeped in stories of American sadism, convinced that the lack of immediate execution was merely a stay of proceedings for more creative cruelties. However, the reality they encountered was far more disorienting. Instead of the bayonet, they were met with the clipboard. Instead of the lash, they were met with medical sulfa powder and clean water. The GIs, often chewing gum or leaning casually against the fenders of Willis jeeps, treated the Japanese not as hated enemies to be tormented, but as a logistical burden to be processed, cleaned, and fed. This indifference was, in many ways, more damaging to the Japanese ego than overt hostility. It suggested that the mighty imperial warrior was, to the American, simply another task on a long daily to-do list. The emotional contrast was centered on the concept of human value. In the imperial army, a soldier was often viewed as a consumable resource, a matchstick to be burned for the emperor. Their officers had beaten them for minor infractions, and their medical care had been virtually non-existent during the retreat into the caves. Now, they found themselves being examined by American corpsmen who applied antiseptic to their festering tropical ulcers with a clinical, almost gentle efficiency. The prisoners sat in stunned silence as they were handed clean towels and bars of soap that smelled of industrial lye and lavender. This was the first crack in the ideological armor. If the Americans were the monsters the propaganda claimed, why were they wasting precious medicine on a defeated enemy? Why were they providing clean water to men who had tried to kill them only 48 hours prior? The factual records of these early encounters describe a state of catatonic shock among many prisoners. They were trapped between two worlds, the one they had left, which demanded their death, and the one they had entered, which insisted on their survival. As the GIs handed out the first cigarettes, brands like Lucky Strike or Camel, the prisoners took them with trembling hands, waiting for the catch. They watched the Americans laugh among themselves, sharing jokes and tossing baseballs in the rare moments of downtime. This display of humanity was a tactical masterstroke of which the GIs were largely unaware. By treating the prisoners with a basic utilitarian decency, the Americans were inadvertently dismantling the very foundation of the Japanese will to resist. The soldiers who had been prepared to die for a cause found themselves wondering why their own leaders had never provided the level of care now being offered by their sworn enemies. The stage was set for a transformation that would begin not with a political speech, but with a meal. By the fifth day of captivity, the sensory environment of the stockade had shifted from the scent of antiseptic to the heavy, sweet aroma of the American field kitchen. The centerpiece of this transformation was a recurring symbolic object that would come to represent the incomprehensible scale of American democracy, a humble, vibrant yellow pudding. In the industrial logic of the U.S. Army, dessert was not a luxury reserved for the elite, but a standard component of the dietary requirements for maintaining morale. While the Japanese prisoners sat in the dust, watching with narrow, suspicious eyes, the American cooks began the process of rehydrating massive quantities of powdered milk and egg yolks. This was not food prepared with the delicate aesthetic precision of a Kyoto tea house. It was food prepared with the brute force efficiency of a Detroit assembly line. The symbolic weight of the pudding lay in its sheer redundancy. To a man who has spent months eating bark and raw snails to survive, the idea of a soft, sweet, nutritionally non-essential paste is an absurdity. The prisoners watched as the Americans stirred the vats with large wooden paddles, the thick substance bubbling slowly over the portable gasoline stoves. For the Japanese, every calorie in their previous life had been a hard-won victory against the encroaching shadow of death. Now, they were witnessing the creation of a substance that served no purpose other than to provide pleasure and a quick surge of glucose. It was a visual and olfactory manifestation of American abundance, a nation so wealthy, so secure in its supply lines, that it could afford to manufacture, ship, and serve sunshine in a bowl to its enemies in the middle of a scorched battlefield. The cooks, largely indifferent to the ideological crisis they were provoking, ladled the yellow mixture into deep metal trays. The texture of the pudding was smooth, reflecting the harsh Pacific sun with a glossy sheen that made it look more like a chemical compound than a meal. This recurring symbol of the sweetness of freedom stood in stark contrast to the grim, ascetic reality of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In the Japanese worldview, strength was found in the ability to endure lack. In the American worldview, strength was the ability to provide plenty. As the trays were carried toward the serving lines, the air around the stockade became thick with the scent of vanilla and processed sugar, a scent that acted as a chemical wedge, slowly prying apart the prisoners' commitment to a philosophy of starvation and sacrifice. The pudding was not just a snack, it was a psychological weapon of the highest order, wrapped in the guise of a nursery comfort. As the first trays of the shimmering yellow substance reached the serving tables, a wave of audible derision rippled through the ranks of the Japanese prisoners. Led by a sergeant whose face was a map of scars and sun-blasted skin, the men began to laugh, a dry, hacking sound that carried more bitterness than humor. They pointed skeletal fingers at the pudding, whispering to one another in hushed, jagged tones. To these warriors, who had been raised on the iron-cold logic of the Bushido code, the sight of the soft, trembling custard was the ultimate confirmation of American weakness. They saw it as baby food, a decadent and ridiculous indulgence that proved their captors were not true soldiers, but pampered children who lacked the spiritual fortitude to consume real rations. In their minds, a man who required sugar and cream to function was a man who could never truly master the rigors of the battlefield. This moment of ridicule was a defensive mechanism, a final attempt to cling to a sense of superiority even in the face of total defeat. The sergeant, a veteran of the campaigns in Manchuria, looked at the American guards with a sneer of profound contempt. He believed that the Americans were trying to humiliate them further by offering food fit for toothless infants. In the Japanese military culture of 1944, masculinity was inextricably linked to the endurance of hardship. To eat something so soft, so sweet, and so visually absurd was viewed as an act of self-emasculation. They mocked the texture, mocking the way it wobbled in the heat, and mocked the GIs who ate it with such obvious relish. It was a scene of extreme emotional contrast, the starving, broken captives laughing at the very substance that represented the industrial might and logistical genius of the nation that had crushed them. The GIs, for their part, watched the laughter with a mixture of confusion and amusement. To the boys from Iowa and New Jersey, pudding wasn't a symbol of ideology, it was just Tuesday's dessert. They didn't understand the complex layer of shame and cultural defiance that fueled the prisoners' outbursts. As the first Japanese soldier was signaled to step forward and receive his portion, he did so with a theatrical reluctance, his jaw set in a hard line of defiance. He took the mess tin as if it were filled with poison, his eyes locked on his comrades, seeking their approval for his continued resistance. The air was thick with the tension of this ideological standoff. The laughter continued to echo against the corrugated metal of the camp buildings, a desperate, hollow sound that would soon be silenced by the most basic of human senses. The ridicule was the high water-mark of their indoctrination, a final stand before the physical reality of American abundance shattered their remaining illusions. The first soldier reached the head of the line, his movements jerky and laden with a performative disgust. He looked down at his mess tin, where a generous dollop of the yellow pudding sat quivering against the dull metal. Behind him, his comrades watched with bated breath, their mocking whispers hanging in the humid air like a foul mist. With a final, defiant glance toward the sergeant, The soldier dipped his crude wooden spoon into the mixture and brought it to his lips. The transition was instantaneous. As the first contact occurred, the sneer of the warrior dissolved into the wide-eyed shock of a child. The sensory overload was total. The creaminess was a textural revelation to a palate that had been assaulted by the grit of dirt and the sharpness of raw roots for months. It was not just the sugar, it was the profound, silky smoothness that spoke of a world without edges. The taste was a physical blow. To the starving man, the rush of glucose and dairy was like a surge of electricity, a chemical reminder of a life before the madness of the front lines. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon, as the vanilla-infused richness coated his tongue. The ridicule that had fueled the group moments before vanished, replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. One by one, the other prisoners followed. The sound of hacking laughter was replaced by the soft, rhythmic scraping of spoons against metal. The emotional contrast was harrowing. These were men who had been prepared to commit ritual suicide for a regime that couldn't provide them with basic grain, and now they were being brought to their knees by a bowl of custard. The sweetness was not just a flavor, it was a sensory betrayal of everything they had been taught about the decadent West. Factual observations of this phenomenon often describe a profound psychological quietus. The prisoners did not speak. They ate with a desperate, singular focus, many of them licking the tin clean until the metal shone. The pudding, that baby food they had mocked, was now revealed as a miracle of chemistry and logistics. It was the taste of a civilization that had mastered the earth. The contrast between the bitter memory of their own army's starvation rations and this effortless, sweet abundance was too vast to bridge with ideology alone. In that moment of consumption, the barrier between enemy and captor began to erode. The pudding had bypassed their rational minds and spoken directly to their starving bodies, delivering a truth that no propaganda could counter. The nation that produced this had already won the war. The act of tasting had transformed the meal into a quiet, personal surrender. The physical act of consumption triggered a rapid psychological collapse that no amount of military discipline could arrest. As the sweetness of the pudding lingered on their palates, the foundational myths of the Japanese Empire began to crumble. For years, these men had been fed a narrative of Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, which asserted that their superior willpower would eventually overcome the material decadence of the West. They had been taught that Americans were soft, over-reliant on comforts, and ultimately fragile under the pressure of total war. Yet, as they sat in the dust of a conquered island, eating food that their own nation could not even dream of producing in wartime, the lie became unsustainable. The presence of the pudding was the ultimate proof of a terrifying truth. The soft Americans possessed a surplus of such magnitude that even their mercy was a display of power. Factual records of interrogation sessions from Saipan and Tinian reveal a stark shift in the prisoners' internal dialogue. Many soldiers began to openly question the wisdom of their commanders who had sent them to die on barren rocks while the enemy was shipping millions of pounds of sugar across the Pacific. The master race narrative, which relied on the perceived weakness of the democratic world, was dismantled by the reality of a single desert. This was not the result of a coordinated propaganda campaign, but the byproduct of an industrial system so robust that it treated the feeding of prisoners with the same mechanical efficiency as the manufacturing of artillery shells. The psychological impact of seeing GIs casually toss aside extra rations while the Japanese army had been reduced to cannibalism in some sectors of the Pacific created a sense of existential vertigo. The ideological re-evaluation forced upon these men was agonizing. To accept the pudding was to accept the failure of their own system. If the American way of life could provide such luxury in the midst of a global cataclysm, then the American way of life was fundamentally more successful than the one they had been sworn to defend. This realization often led to a state of profound depression followed by a strange, quiet compliance. The hardened sergeant, who had led the laughter only an hour prior, now sat with his head bowed, his mess tin empty and gleaming. The transformation was not just about the food. It was about the realization that they had been lied to about the nature of their enemy. The barbarians were not only technologically superior, they were capable of a casual, industrial-scale humanity that was more overwhelming than any B-29 raid. The pudding had become a mirror, reflecting the hollow reality of their own empire's promises. The transformation of the Japanese prisoners was not a loud or violent event, but a quiet, internal shattering of a lifelong belief system. As the final traces of the yellow pudding were consumed, the stockade grew heavy with the weight of unsaid realizations. Among the men, the transformation was evident in their eyes. The manic, feverish glint of indoctrination had been replaced by a flat, sober clarity. They looked at their hands, then at the American guards, and finally at the vast, humming infrastructure of the camp. The realization was as simple as it was devastating. They had been fighting a ghost of their own making. The weak, decadent Americans did not exist. In their place stood a civilization that could effortlessly bridge the gap between the ferocity of combat and the gentleness of providing dessert. This realization was the true end of the war for these men, occurring long before the final signatures were placed on the deck of the USS Missouri. Documented accounts from the period highlight a recurring theme in the testimonies of these survivors: the shocking discovery that their captors viewed them as human beings worthy of the same caloric surplus as an American citizen. One prisoner later reflected on the moment he realized that the nation which could afford to provide its enemies with pudding was a nation that could never be exhausted. It was a realization of total, crushing defeat, not by the sword, but by the spoon. This psychological shift turned the stockade into a place of strange, cooperative stillness. The prisoners began to assist with camp chores, moving with a new sense of purpose that was detached from the emperor's will. They were no longer shattered jewels, waiting for a glorious end. They were men who had discovered that the world contained possibilities of abundance they had never been allowed to imagine. The transformation extended to the very core of their identity. The soldiers who had once mocked the baby food now understood that the soft texture was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of a society that valued the preservation of life over the aesthetics of suffering. The ridicule of the previous hour felt like a distant, childish memory. They saw that the American GI was not a devil because he ate pudding. He was a formidable opponent because his society was strong enough to ensure he never had to go without it. The ideological foundation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, built on the glorification of scarcity and the nobility of hunger, could not survive the chemical reality of sugar and cream. By the time the sun began to set over the Saipan stockade, the men within it were no longer the same soldiers who had emerged from the caves. They had been conquered by a system that understood that the most effective way to dismantle an enemy's will was to show them a better way to live. The long shadows of the watchtowers stretch across the stockade, marking the end of a day that changed the internal landscape of 500 men. As the cooling air of the Pacific night settles over Saipan, the clatter of the field kitchen fades, leaving behind a silence that is no longer filled with the tension of expected death. The Japanese prisoners sit in small groups, their bodies finally fueled by the calories of a nation they were told was their inferior. In the dim light, the galvanized vats that held the yellow pudding stand empty, scrubbed clean by men who once viewed their contents with a mocking contempt. This simple dessert, a mixture of powder, water, and industrial willpower, has performed a task that no naval bombardment could achieve. It has provided a glimpse into the heart of a different kind of power, one that is not rooted in the nobility of suffering, but in the radical, overwhelming generosity of abundance. The legacy of the Pacific War is often measured in the tonnage of ships sunk or the square mileage of islands captured, but the true victory was frequently won in these small, quiet moments of cultural collision. The story of the pudding is a poetic reflection on the nature of freedom and the ideology of plenty. It illustrates the moment when the shattered jewel of Imperial Japan met the assembly line of American democracy and found itself wanting. For the prisoners on Saipan, The sweetness of that meal was the first taste of a new world, one where a human being's value was not determined by their willingness to die in a cave, but by their participation in a system that could afford to care for its enemies. The industrial scale of the American supply chain was not merely a tool of war. It was a testament to the idea that a society built on the prosperity of its citizens is ultimately more resilient than one built on their sacrifice. As the stars emerge over the Philippine Sea, the transformation of the prisoners remains a silent testament to a larger truth. The war in the Pacific was a struggle between two versions of the future, one that looked back toward the ascetic rigors of a feudal past, and one that looked forward toward a horizon of shared comfort and infinite resource. The yellow pudding, in all its humble, wobbly simplicity, was the herald of that future. It represented the triumph of a civilization that could weaponize its sweetness to dismantle a culture of hate. In the end, the most enduring victory of the American spirit was not found in the fire of the atomic bomb, but in the simple, undeniable reality of a bowl of custard served in the dirt of a battlefield. It was the sweetness of freedom, delivered with the mechanical certainty of a nation that had decided that no one, not even a defeated foe, should have to live in a world without the luxury of a dessert.